Hello and welcome to another video. Today I'll be talking about springless suspension. This is one car that I've made that does not use any springs for its suspension. It uses bearings on controllers with a reduction mechanism. Um, this is not the first time I've ever made um, a springless suspension mechanism. Uh, The reason why I don't like using springs as suspension is because of the rotational forces springs can produce when the connected block is has a sideways force given to it. It can induce a very powerful rotational force. Um, and for some cars, literally all cars, it can make it easier for it to potentially flip over. Um, and here I have the first. Um, so this is the car that I developed the suspension on. Um, a rally car of mine. You can see that it obviously has springy characteristics. Um, and how this works is I remember thinking about a mechanism I could use to reduce the torque mechanically, like a lever. And I remember looking around and finding a pair of vice grips. And that's when I got the idea that the clamp would be like where the bearing is, and the handle would be like where the wheel is. Um, and this is that mechanism. Um, it it can provide a lot of force, not enough. It can't provide enough force to the point where the car has almost no suspension at all, but it's using this reduction mechanism. Um, the bar that I will paint blue here is traveling a certain radius, and the bar above it that I will paint green is traveling a slightly different radius. So the 2 points where they are connected to each other um, have to move different distances, and the only way that can be achieved is if the angle between them changes. And the angle between them that they change is actually very small compared to how much this will actually travel. And that's how the reduction is achieved for that car. For this car, um, it's much more compact. It's probably a little bit hard for me to show, but much like in the other one, the the lever here um, will travel a certain distance, or well, so again there are different radiuses. So um, looking at it purely from a side-to-side perspective, how much does their position change in that direction? Because after all, uh, the wheel isn't being held upright. It doesn't have a second part like that does. So um, this point this point is much closer to its point of rotation than this one is. So depending on how far up and down the wheel is in its travel, this point where its location will be side to side, and that's where this bearing is trying to control. The only way that it can be at 90 degrees is if this is completely flat. If this is pulled down a little bit, this point will be slightly more upwards toward the top, and from a sideways perspective, slightly closer to the left. And thus the angle between this part and this part changes. Um, The amount of force that the bearing on the controller provides can change depending on, primarily depends on what angle you have it set to. But for different tensions, you really have to play with the geometry much more. It's not too hard to translate these into suspension mechanisms that can um, accommodate for a drive shaft if you want to have, say, a car powered by a piston engine. But I very much prefer this form of suspension over normal spring operated suspension because personally, at least all the experience I have with it, it's smoother and the rotational force processing is more accurate. Um, for the rally car that I showed yesterday, um, the place where it's connected is a bit different. Um, Instead of being on these two bearings, it's further back. Uh, it's about the simplest way to make the suspension stiffer. And again, how I mentioned the damping, this is using an engine in the back that is constantly turned off to provide damping to the suspension in this car. And that's what I think lets it perform so well, um, primarily. Because not only is the suspension able to handle the rough terrain very nicely, but it can um, dampen it, something that the normal springs can't do. Uh, the There are some suspension mechanisms where these springs can be integrated into more complex geometries, like double wishbone suspension. Um, there are some configurations where any force is transferred to the spring will induce a rotation counter to that of which any force acting upon the wheel would transfer to the car. So, in terms of how much the car will roll, it's actually quite less, but still, it's not very realistic, or at least it's inducing forces that otherwise would not be induced. And I guess that's all.